Acho que era basicamente isso que eu queria mostrar para vocês. E então, só para deixar claro, toda a lógica de negócio fica nessa parte da Business Logic, e a gente tem em cima disso um servidor GWT que faz de fato o depara, né? A transformação necessária para falar entre o nosso software antigo com essa interface toda na frente nova. Então é isso, queria só agradecer a vocês, e aqui tem meu contato, caso alguém queira ter maiores, tirar dúvidas depois, eu estou disponível por e-mail, também vou estar aqui até o fim da apresentação, se vocês quiserem entender um pouco mais sobre como a gente desenvolveu isso. Falando, a gente tem uma equipe de 30 desenvolvedores, 30 programadores que estão desenvolvendo essa ferramenta no nosso escritório no Rio. Então vou voltar para o Chris, para ele continuar entrando em mais detalhes sobre o GWT para aplicações Enterprise.
Thanks, Otavio. So there was one thing about his story that resonated with me quite well when I originally met him, well, geez, about a year ago actually, which is that it was an existing application, existing infrastructure that they were able to move over to use Google Web Toolkit. So if you're sitting here today and you work for a company and you're steeped in legacy technology, don't think that there's not a chance that you could move into making killer web apps. Right? You saw it right there. He has a typical back-end system that, like many of us have had at some point in time when we've worked for various companies. And what they started doing was they started carving out portions where they could use GWT. And by segmenting it, and by probably having very good design patterns as well, they were able to say, okay, this portion still goes to the existing back-end, and this portion goes to the new back-end and resulting new front-end, which was built with GWT. And it's an important note as I'm going to work through the next portion of the deck. So we briefly touched on this morning some of the integration work that we've been doing with VMware and Spring Tools. And today, while Eric Ptolemy was talking about cloud portability, I'm going to bring it up one more time. I want to really focus on developer tools. I mean, that is our core competency back in the new office where I come from. It's all about developer tools. So the motivation was, in fact, cloud portable business apps. But there was another side part, too, which is that I want to see hyper-optimized business apps running in the browser. That's really my goal, and I share that goal with several people back at Google, more than several. So what we did was we took a look at the anatomy of a typical business app, right? Now, this is a broad brushstroke. I don't expect that this is actually applicable to everything, but we said, you know what, there's a range of developers, first of all. There's ISVs and enterprise developers. They typically contain a lot of boilerplate code. They end up being primed for code generation. I think we can do something about that. And there's forms over data, usually, for the simplistic ones. And they're not optimized for the browser, not all of them at least. So how can we fix this? And this was going back to Eric's point that when we looked at the lay of the land, when we looked at who was out there, we saw Spring, we said, you know what, they have a set of tools that perfectly mimics what we have. And I'm going to show you that. But first I want to talk about developer lifecycle. So we said, okay, given that this is the anatomy of the app, given that this is what you're going to build, or what you have right now, what does it look like when you build it? Right? So we talked about we talked about basically generating code, bootstrapping your application, getting up and running. Like, how long does that take? Does it take 1 day? Does it take 3 days? Does it take an entire week? Like, you know, when you start a new project and then all of a sudden your dev manager comes along or the PM comes along, pesky PMs, come along and they say, you know, got a new show? It's demo day. What do you have? Right? How long does it take to bootstrap your application and get going? Well, once you have that, you want to iterate. You want to write some code. This is actually where the fun begins, because then you've got a great environment, you might have a small team you're working with, and you're just in a really fast cycle. Then you get close to the end, you want to start debugging, so you want to fix some code. You're going to optimize some code, like you're at that last 20, 10, 55% of your application, and then you ship, right? So go celebrate, get some sleep. So this is the typical development life cycle. For building the app that I just showed, how do we create a set of developer tools that make this seamless? So we look at the tools you may know. Spring Developer Tools, I've covered most of these. Spring Root generates code. Spring Source Tools is your IDE. Spring Insight is it's a performance metric gathering tool that allows you to identify sluggishness in your application. We'll talk about that more in a second. Then we noticed that VMware, the parent company of Spring, had a cloud technology called vFabric that allows you to deploy to on-premise environments And then essentially they had tools to build business apps fast. Okay, so they had the business portion of fast down. Then we looked at what we had. So we have Google Developer Tools. We have Google Web Toolkit, our Java to JavaScript compiler and code generation. Google plugin for Eclipse, which gets you back into the IDE. A speed tracer to measure sluggishness in the browser. And then we have, obviously, cloud technology, App Engine for business, as well as the consumer-facing App Engine. And the net was that we have tools for building killer web apps. So if you bring the two together, then we've accomplished what I first set out, which is the anatomy of a business app and the lifecycle, the developer lifecycle. So when you break it down, you've got Spring Room, GWT. You want to optimize for developers, minimize boilerplate, and ultimately get that nice Ajax feel. So it looks like feels like you're running a desktop application in your browser. When you want to iterate, you've moved on in the cycle. Use Spring Source Tool Suite and Google Plugin for Eclipse to easily install. It's baked into STS, so if you actually download Spring Source Tool Suite when you leave, you'll have a dashboard where you can immediately get our tools to get started. So there's not a bunch of moving around to find some SDK and some plugin, it's just there. Once you have it, you can build your app fast, code generation, refactoring, quick fixes, and you can iterate quickly. As I showed off this morning in the keynote, and as well as in the first session, in-browser debugging, no compiler phase, no deployment phase. One of the topics that I haven't touched on was how you optimize your application. And that's using Speed Tracer along with backends such as App Engine and Spring Insight. And what Speed Tracer does, it has, like I said in my first session, it has hooks into WebKit, which is what Safari and Chrome are built on top of, to actually measure things like paint, layouts, garbage collection, so that when your app starts running slow, you can easily tell, just speed trace it. And then what we have done is we've integrated that with back-end solutions, right, such as Speed Tracer and App Stats for App Engine, that will give you the server-side metrics, bring them together in one unified UI to see, okay, this is why it's slow in the browser, this is why it's slow in the server. I have a holistic view, I have a round-trip view of why it's slow. So then finally, when you're done bootstrapping, iterating, debugging, optimizing, you want to deploy. And this was the goal from kind of a high level when we went to integrate the two products, was that you should be able to choose one of these to deploy to. VMware vCloud, Google App Engine, VMware vSphere, any other cloud. We actually made that happen, so I want to show one more demo before we move on. So how many of you are familiar with Spring Development? How many of you actually used Spring Development? All right. So there's a conference called Spring One that happened last week in Chicago. We went out there and had a great time. It was my first time ever at that conference meeting some other developers. But one of the things we did was, it was the first time they were announcing hosted SQL support coming out of App Engine for Business. This is one of the things that Eric had talked about in his keynote. It's very close to being production grade. Right now we're in the trusted tester phase. That means we've got a beta quality version of it that we're getting people involved in. And one of the people we got involved in it was a Spring engineer. And we said, you know what would be really, really cool? If you could take one of your Spring apps that's never run an App Engine before, has all the Spring backend, has all the SQL integration, and you could just drop it on App Engine. That would be proof that we've actually accomplished our goal. And sure enough, with literally like maybe changing, I asked them 25 lines of code out of like 20,000 lines of code, had it running in a weekend. So this is their travel app, just a basic app that comes with Spring Webflow. Has nothing to do with Spring Room, has nothing to do with Google Web Toolkit, has everything to do with running on App Engine, as you can see by the URL. It's tough for you to see in the back, but it's running off of appspot.com. This is the hotel application, it's a travel application. And so I can go in, and I can search for hotels, so maybe in Chicago. And there you go, I've actually queried a SQL backend, hosted in our cloud, and I brought back a result, and I can click on that. Here we go, view hotel, sorry about that. Brings up that, I can say book it. Okay, I'm gonna pick my date. And I want non-smoking, ocean view. And I don't have a fake credit card number right now. But you can see it's querying the system right now and pulling back the results. All he had to do, this was the nice part, all he had to do to get this to happen, besides tweaking a few lines of code, was replace the JDBC driver that he was using and the connection string. That was it. So when we talk about these things being cloud portable, we're really serious about it, and this is proof positive that this is actually going on. So the framework, the new Google 2.1 release. So when Spring Root goes off and generates a whole bunch of code, as you saw this morning, it's got to generate that code for something, right? And it's got to generate it for some framework. And what we've done is Spring and a lot of the enterprise community are built on top of